one after another. The question is, what is going on with the system? How can we, in a way, take away the loopholes in the system to avoid all of these corruptions? Mr. Gao.
I think the recent events fully demonstrate that dealing with individual corrupt officers is not enough and not sufficient. Eventually, I think China needs to come up with a whole range of institutional checks and balances to prevent any government and party official from doing any corruption cases like this on such a magnitude. And I think right now it's still in the middle of dealing with all the corrupt officials and try to weed them out. But eventually I think institutional setup and checks and balance will be absolutely necessary for the second stage.
Institutional setup, of course, that's a really challenging part. In a different nature, in a way. Professor Liu, you've been working on business ethics all over the world. What do you think are some of the most important elements that should be included in this system to avoid the loopholes?
I think number one is really to reduce the temptation to those greedy people. If you really hire too many cats to look after the fish, so there's going to be a problem. So we need to reduce the number of fish. And so therefore we need a smaller government really to boost the social efficiency. And of course the check and balance is very important, and also the media role is also utterly important to have a early discovery of those issues and to expose those people and mobilize popular opinion against those people. So therefore only relying on the two cages, which are the party line and law, which are important, but that's not enough. The media
that is really the bottom line, almost in a way,
Absolutely.
to guarantee the fight against the corruption, but not necessarily going to be a sustainable way to eventually root it out, the problems and the causes of corruption. Having said that, though, there's an important issue going on in China, that is reform and opening up will continue, as being suggested by the central government over and over again. And yet, in reform, you have to encourage people to take their experiments and momentums. And sometimes the experiments are not necessarily going to be clearly defined in legal frameworks, not to mention when it comes to issues as to the disciplines officials should obey or not. So, Professor Liu, here comes the challenging one. That is, how can you, on the one hand, reform, encourage people to experiment, do new things, on the other hand, avoid their chances of being corruptive or involved in any way in corruption?
All the Chinese reform process is really to move into the uncharted area, and therefore we need innovation in the system construction, and also we need courageous people to dare into those dark corners. But right now, I think the legal construction and also ethical construction are not there to synchronize with this pace to move forward. So before we really have a very complete and also enforceable legal construction. So the two types of education are very important. One is the Chinese traditional ethics, self-discipline and self-regulation, which are important. And the other is the party line. I think the Communist Party is there to tighten the discipline. And so this type 2 cage can serve, number one, as a coercion to possible corruption. The other is really to serve as a constant reminder of, for them to resist the temptation.
Well, there are a lot of, TV dramas, novels recently coming out, even in the form of movies as well, that the public really enjoy about how China is fighting corruption. But I guess this kind of awareness is important. But even more importantly is how to, as we mentioned earlier, one hand, encourage further change for the better, reform. On the other hand, mend defenses of the existing system.
Well, absolutely. I think there are many things that we need to do. First of all, for example, for those corruption cases which have happened before the more recent launch of the anti-corruption campaign, how do you do with that? Secondly, for example, what will be the institutional build-up in terms of checks and balances to fight against and prevent future occurrence of new corruption cases? And then, for example, for all these very senior government and party officers sitting in very high positions of power, they probably have been tainted by corruption. They have been guilty of corruption, but they are still exercising great power, doing very important party and government functions. So how to deal with this group of people, and also how to prevent younger generation of party and government leaders and corporate leaders from becoming corrupt.
Right.
So
And the list goes on, I guess.
Absolutely.
At this point, you heard both from the Chinese President Xi Jinping, and also, of course, he's also the party secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, and also coming from the Premier Li Keqiang is about officials. Now, you need to pay attention, no corruption. But at the same time, you have to work really hard to make sure that there is going to be reform, there's going to be hard work, there's going to be systematic change for the better. The question is how, isn't it?
I personally do not see a contradiction in the need to continue to push reform, and on the other hand, to really be steady and relentless in fighting against corruption. I think there need to be really major institutional and systematic changes and checks and balances being introduced, and that will ensure that reform will continue into the future, and the system will become more clean and more transparent, and less government and party officials will be able to commit corruption, even if they want to.
Professor Liu, you know, in China, things happen fast. The reason why we are lack of a system sufficient yet to rein in corruption, and not necessarily have to rely only on the legal punishment against corruption to face this challenge, is because things happen so fast.
That's right.
30 years reform opening up, officials have a lot of power in hand, and they probably have to because they need to exercise this power in order to bring change. But now you see a stage in which their power has to be limited. But to what degree and to what degree not? That is also an interesting question. Speed, efficiency vis-a-vis efficiency of the system. I think those are two very different things, Professor Liu.
Yeah, I think the arbitrarily at the beginning stage of the Chinese reform, the efficiency was really the priority, and in which, ironically, actually corruption plays a role in oiling the wheel for the bureaucracy. Actually, you know, but right now the social equity becomes most important issue. So when everyone is getting better off, and then we really earn the time and space to streamline the social construction, and also to motivate people to look after, you know, their own interest, both in terms of poverty and the personal safety, against the possible erosion of the government represented by those, corrupted officials.
China really has punished more than 1 million officials recently regarded as both the high-ranking officials as well as the low-level ones, so-called flies, for corruption since the year 2012. Let's take a look at these numbers. At the beginning of the anti-graft campaign, the little tigers were punished, and then the number increased dramatically every year. 2015, for example, 64 tigers were punished, but in the year 2016, the number of corruption cases reportedly decreased for the very first time. That is, of course, the latest number we have got. But the question really is how to proceed to the future. Professor Liu, you mentioned earlier about the system building. Mr. Gao, as you know, there are things, if you do reform, that has never occurred before. And you don't have a legal framework, you don't even have a bureaucratic framework to specifically tell you whether it is corrupt, quote unquote, or has the potential of having corruption. So that comes to a very critical and also sensitive stage. Mr. Gao.
No, I think, first of all, I think the Chinese party and the country, the system, the government, the society at large need to come up with certain presumptions. One important corruption is power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Therefore, we should have no complacency. We should have no naivete. We cannot leave power unchecked, unbalanced in the hands of individual officers, because otherwise, even if they are angels, they will become devils in no time.
That's right.
They have no ability to resist against the temptation of power. That means power need to be checked and balanced. That's simple. Up to now, we have not yet reached that point yet. We are still dealing with the corrupt officials on an individual basis. Sometimes they even gang together in one party officer or one institution, one company, etc. But we need to go beyond this stage of dealing with individual corruption cases. We really need to think very thoroughly about institutional checks and balances to prevent crimes.
On the one hand, go against corruption. On the other hand, still building confidence of the people in the system and for the society to get better. That's also another delicate balance. Mr. Liu.
Yeah, I think we still need to go for professionalization, meaning that the government will have to be very much defined in their job responsibility so that they will not invade into ordinary people's lives. They will not invade into the role that the market really can possibly play. So right now, this line is not drawn clear. And there are so many red tapes that really are not necessary, that are actually they erect the barrier and that really entrench the fantasized power of those government officials so that they can really take unfair advantage of both individuals and those businesses.
Right.
And the other is that how local government are really tamed to deal with the their own responsibility, like the environmental issue, like the community communication issue. But right now, I see that most of the Chinese local governments are doing business. They are there to contribute to GDP temporarily, but social justice are not really there to be properly safeguarded.
Talking about this is an interesting point. That is how different organizations within the central government and the relations between the central government and local government, how can it work toward, once again, a better consensus to root out corruption and also a better system eventually to root out corruption. I think that is also a central point. Mr. Gao.
Absolutely. I think the Chinese Communist Party and the system itself are not wasting any time in coming up with more innovative ways, new institutional systematic changes to prevent corruption. However, I think what has been done is all necessary but not sufficient yet. We need to continue to make great efforts in this regard to try more innovation and also come up with a presumption to make sure that power is not too much concentrated and individual officers will not be able to lay their hands on too much concentrated power to commit corruption. That's
2017, of course, is a big political year here in China. We'll see how things will move from here toward building a systematic approach to mend defenses and also to get out the loopholes for corruption.